Hey guys, welcome back to Ripe Stories. In this video, a neighbor trapped and locked up my service dogs claiming that dogs are not allowed in the neighborhood. Let's dive right into the video to find out what happened. And the first one is a story from r/traumatized them back, and it is titled, "Thanks for the unsolicited advice on my dying father." So I got a new co-worker a couple months back. For reasons he was obsessed with golfing, after a couple days of working in each other's vicinity, he decided it was time to get to know his co-worker, aka me. It's pretty basic small talk at first, but eventually he starts talking about golf. It's a pleasant enough conversation, and at some point he asks if I ever played. I said no, but that my dad loved to golf. He asked how often my dad golfed, and I gave the answer that he went weekly until he got sick. "He cannot let some sickness get him down. Gotta power through. That is how you get better." After a while of me dancing around the details, while he goes on about how my dad needed to get back out there, I finally just tell him that my dad has cancer. "He cannot let that cancer beat him. My aunt has breast cancer and she never stopped doing the things she loved." My dad was diagnosed very recently, so this happened when that wound was still very fresh. I interrupted my new friend and told him that, well, it's a little hard for him to get around now, what with the seizure he had that took his control over the left side of his body and the surgery he had recently for his stage 4 brain cancer. I did not hear another word from him the rest of my shift. He quit before my next one. And the next one is a super interesting malicious compliance story that is titled, "Pipe Exploded on the Weekend, but hey, at least we saved on overtime." And by the way, if you enjoy the r/traumatized them back stories, please don't forget to let me know in the comments because I appreciate your feedback. So this story starts like this. In 2006, I worked as a maintenance technician in a small office building. My job was to make sure everything works properly, air conditioning, plumbing, electricity, all that kind of stuff. Then we got a new boss from some big corporate office, and he was obsessed with cutting costs. First week he tells us all, in a very serious voice, "From now on, absolutely no overtime, no matter what, no exceptions." We all kind of looked at each other like, is he serious? So Friday afternoon, around 4:30 p.m, I get an alert from the boiler room. Apparently, pressure is in one of the water pipes very high. I check it and the pipe is actually vibrating like crazy. I know if we don't release the pressure or fix it, it's gonna explode. I go to the boss and tell him, "This pipe is dangerous. I need maybe 1 or 2 hours overtime to fix it tonight." He looks at the clock and says, "It is past 5 soon. No overtime. We will handle it on Monday." Okay, boss, no problem. Well, so I go home. Saturday morning, I get a call from the security guy who works weekends. He is freaking out. Water is pouring out of the boiler room. It has flooded the hallway. What do I do? I laugh and I say, well, it's too late. Nothing we can do now. Perhaps swim? On Monday, the boss walks in and smells wet carpet and disaster. Half the ground floor is underwater, documents ruined, IT equipment drowned. Rest in peace. He comes to me angry and said, "Why didn't you stop this?" I just say, "Well, you told me no overtime. The pipe did not want to wait until Monday." The cleanup cost thousands, and guess what? From that day, the boss never said no to overtime again. In fact, from then on, when we reported just an inkling of a suspicion that something might be wrong, he simply said, "Do what you have to do, just don't tell me the hours." Well, sometimes the pipe is the best teacher. And now let's dive right into the title story, which is titled, "Neighbor Traps and Locks Up My Service Dog, Claims That Dogs Are Not Allowed in the Neighborhood." However, before we proceed, I just wanted to inform you that I would advise you to turn on the bell on my channel so you don't miss any daily uploads, since the algorithm is really weird at the moment and it really loves to not show new videos to my existing subscribers. As we all know, YouTube really does not appreciate loyal viewers. Anyway, for a little bit of background, I've been dealing with a non-visible disability for quite a few years now. In the beginning, I thought that it was just something I had to grit my teeth and bear, no matter how bad it got. However, that all changed 2 years ago when a friend of mine mentioned that you can actually get special dogs to help with my particular disability. I looked into it and eventually decided to try using certified service dogs. Long story short, I fell in love and got 2 of them. It is impossible to overstate just how invaluable they've been to me and my quality of life, and I have no idea what I would do without them. They absolutely make my life bearable, which is why someone going after them is just about the worst thing I can imagine. I would much rather break my own leg than have one of them come to harm. However, it's important to note that I don't actually need my dogs 24/7. I need them often, and it's a great source of comfort to know that they are always available if I do need them, but I regularly leave them at home when I go out for short errands. On the day in question, that is exactly what happened. I'd been out getting some groceries and had been gone for no more than 2 hours when I got home and found that my dogs were nowhere inside. I thought that I had left them in the backyard to get some fresh air and play, but when I didn't find them there, I figured that my memory must have just been playing tricks on me. I leave them inside most of the time, so surely that is where they were. Well, I checked every room, no sign of the dogs and no response when I called either. Needless to say, I started to panic, and when I panic, then I need my dogs more than ever. You could say it is a vicious circle, and I was in a bad way. It was not long at all before I was stumbling out into the street shouting for them and rushing from door to door to ask my neighbors if they had seen my precious companions. I got 2-3 houses down the street before I heard barking and scratching. At first I was just overwhelmingly relieved somehow my dogs must have gotten out, and then one of my neighbors had caught them for me before they could get into serious danger. I was overcome with relief to the point that I could feel tears in my eyes. However, as I followed the barking around the side yard, I found that the racket was coming from a shed, and I felt the first pangs of unease. Had my dogs suddenly been acting up? They'd never been aggressive with anyone before. Why did my neighbor feel the need to lock them up in a shed rather than just enclosing them in their backyard? It was not like they were big enough to jump any fences anyway. And then I started to wonder about my big assumption. Just how on earth had my dogs gotten out in the first place? There was no damage to my own fence, and I was absolutely sure that the gate was shut tight. I triple check every time I leave them out there. Had someone opened up the gate while I was gone? Had someone broken into my property? I had just barely opened the shed when there was a sudden shouting behind me. My neighbor had noticed what I was doing, and he was furious. First, he bellowed that I was trespassing, which he might have been right about. However, as soon as I opened the shed door and let my dogs out, he suddenly started shouting about how they are not allowed in the neighborhood and I was a criminal for letting them wander around without leashes. I had not even said a word at this point. I was stunned by the sudden outburst from a neighbor that I had barely even spoken to over the years. At most, we might have exchanged pleasantries a few times when I happened to be out walking, but that was about it. I'd never imagined that he could be so infuriated by my dogs. When I finally did find my tongue, I interrupted him as politely as I could, telling him that these were not just pets, they were certified service dogs. And I needed them in order to function. But when I gestured to them, that is when I noticed just how hard they were panting. It looked like they'd been deprived of water, and it was not a cool day, not at all. It only then occurred to me just how warm the inside of that shed must have been. To this day, I'm not sure how I managed to control my temper when I realized that my dogs had been imprisoned in a sweltering prison without any water. I think my neighbor must have seen just how furious I was because he finally managed to shut up and hold his tongue. Trying to keep my voice as level as I could, I informed him that me and my service animals both had rights that had been infringed upon. I barely even listened to his excuse, but it involved some kind of allergies. I then proceeded to ask him just how he was having an allergic reaction to dogs 3 houses down. He sputtered and tried to come up with some kind of excuse, but he only managed to turn his face a horrible shade of red. I probably should have been more concerned about my safety at that point because he was physically larger than me, but the only thing I could focus on was leaving before I attacked him. I needed to get my dogs and get out of there before I did something that I would really regret. With both of my extremely well-trained dogs in tow, I walked away. As I went, I heard my neighbor shouting about how he was going to call animal control and get my dogs put down for being out of control and a threat to the neighborhood kids. Needless to say, there has never been a single incident with my dogs acting aggressively towards kids, or anyone else for that matter, but his words haunted me when I got home. What if he called animal control and they came out to investigate while I was away from home again? What if he engineered a situation where they were out on the street so they would get taken away to the pound? I had heard horror stories about dogs getting put down before their owners even knew where they were, and my blood ran cold. I had to take the initiative here. That very afternoon I called the police and told them exactly what had happened. While I waited for them to arrive, I started looking into disability rights lawyers to see if I might have some sort of case on my hands here. I saw that I needed to document as much of the evidence as possible, so I tried to write down as many of my neighbors' insults as I could remember. When the police eventually did arrive at my door, I calmly explained the situation as best I could. My dogs were beside me the entire time, so the officers got to see exactly how obedient and well-trained they were. They then proceeded down the street to my neighbor's house to ask for his side of the story. I settled down on the couch to wait for however long that would take, but it turns out that I didn't need to have bothered. I could hear the shouting as soon as they reached my neighbor's yard. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, saying that he was going to get me for this. I think he even tried to run past the police and get to my house, but they restrained him. In no time at all, the rest of our neighbors were watching this horrible saga unfold. I was terribly embarrassed because even though I was still inside my house and watching through the window, there was absolutely no mistaking who he was ranting and raving about. After all, it was not like there was anyone else on our street with service dogs. The police clearly reached the end of their patience because they soon arrested him and took him away. Belatedly, I realized that this whole scene might have been exactly the sort of evidence that I should have if I want to meet a lawyer, but I had not recorded any of it. Well, for once, it turns out that luck was on my side because it seems that half the neighborhood managed to record the confrontation with crystal clear audio, and several of them ended up forwarding their recordings to me. Before I knew this, I knew more than most people about ADA rights, but I was still shocked at how the next few weeks went. I met with a representative from a disability rights organization, and they were absolutely certain that this case was a slam dunk. A stark contrast to my own trepidation that maybe I was wasting everyone's time with my complaints. They were in complete disbelief when I played the recordings that my neighbors had given me, and they promised me that this was going to be a walk in the park. The police locked my neighbor up for unlawful confinement, but the spotlight was on the lawsuit. As it turns out, this was not the first time that this particular neighbor had been in hot water for some kind of discrimination. On one hand, it did explain why he was so obsessed with hating me when we had never really interacted before. On the other hand, it meant that neither the judge nor the jury were willing to give him anything resembling the benefit of the doubt, especially not with the recordings we provided. And that is not even getting into the nasty fines that I heard about later. So besides being arrested and sued, he was also hit by a series of brutal fines. I hope the irony was not lost on my neighbor from hell, but even that was not the biggest blow to his ego. A few months into his struggles, he was forced to sell his house in order to stay afloat. It did not stay on the market long before being snapped up by a lovely family that all happened to be disabled in one way or another. And yeah guys, please let me know in the comments if you still enjoy these crazy neighbor stories, because then I will continue with them. Either way, the next one is a fantastic malicious compliance story that is titled "Could Not Have a Day Off, Fate Had My Back." In my 20s, I spent a little over 5 years working for an oil and gas well service company. It was a 15-on, 6-off rotation. The first 4 years was at a small shop roughly 7 hours from home, at which point I transferred to a much busier shop that was only a few hours from home. 5 years seems like peanuts in the working world, but in this particular line of work, it was a long time. Decent job security as far as oil field work goes, but the pay was marginal at best, so turnover was high. At 5 years, I was the most experienced hand in our shop. The new shop was definitely busier, the money was way better, and I managed to have my days off matched up with a supervisor whose way of doing things meshed perfectly with me. Everything else about the place was awful. My breaking point was being denied a day off with 2 days' notice to attend a funeral for a good friend who was lost to some health complications after a car accident. I was generally pretty understanding that in our line of work it could be difficult to always balance manpower, but the day I requested off passed with 4 other hands sitting around at the shop doing make-work projects to pass the day. Management could not be bothered to take a few minutes to see if they could make things work. It was easier to just say no. To that point in my employment there, I had been extremely flexible with helping out during manpower shortages. I had probably worked in excess of 100 days off and had only ever used 1 sick day. I thought a little reciprocity would have been nice. However, I made up my mind I would fulfill my obligation to work 1 year at that shop as to not have to pay back the $4,000 transfer bonus I had received, and then it would be time to move on. I was only a few months off of that 1 year mark, so I started job shopping immediately and quickly set my sights on a mine that we regularly did work for that was close enough to home that I could commute on a daily basis. I made some inquiries with people I knew that were working there and it seemed right up my alley. Not long after that, I updated my resume and sent it in. A few weeks later, I'm driving back from a job and get a voicemail from HR at the company I applied to. I called back as soon as I had a spare minute and they were looking to have me come in for an interview 2 days later. My heart sank knowing that was gonna be a struggle. I talked with the HR lady, seeing if they had any other dates available, but it was explained to me that they only arrange one interview day once they have enough holds to fill in their crews to justify doing orientation with a group of new hires. She said she could put me as the first call for the next round, but did not know when that would be, and she said it would also be fairly short notice. In the end, I agreed to the interview appointment, not knowing how I was gonna make it work. I immediately went to the assistant manager to ask for time off as he was looking after dispatching duties that week. I told him something important came up at home that I really need to get dealt with. Without hesitation, he said, "No, we have a full board this week. I need you here. Whatever it is, we'll have to wait for your days off." Well, my first thought was that I was just gonna call in sick and go to the job interview. The last thing I wanted to do was worry about being fired from a job I no longer want, but then I realized maybe there was another path forward and went to the job board. And there it was, exactly what I needed, a potentially week-long job for the company I was set to interview with, and the job was scheduled to start the next day. And none of the jobs had been assigned to crews yet. I filled my supervisor in with the circumstances and my plan, and he was on board with it. We went to the assistant manager and offered to take that job. He was delighted to have us volunteer, as not many crews cared to be away from home for a week, mainly be confined to a rig shack. Day 1 went smoothly and we were done by early afternoon. I used the supervisor's truck and went home to get some interview-appropriate clothes. Day 2, we were running a bit behind, but we just barely got the job set up and our tools deployed into the well with enough time for me to grab a quick shower and change of clothes before again taking the supervisor's truck over to the administration building for my interview. I got a call the next week with an offer of a start 2 weeks out. The starting wage was definitely lower than I was making, but they offered clearly defined progression that would have me easily equaling my current income in year 2 and well exceeding it by year 4. Benefits were better and the schedule would give me twice as much time off. Went to give my manager 2 weeks notice and he asked where I was going and what I would be making. He was appalled that I would leave for such a low starting wage. He asked what it would take to keep me. I told him, when a person takes a pay cut to leave, obviously that ship sailed long ago. And before we end the video, we will read a story from r/malicious compliance. It is titled, "I cannot come in late. Okay, I will get disability permission." So last summer, I got a new manager that I reported directly to at work. She had decades of good experience, but none as a manager of people, and well, it turns out she was awful at it. She was given about a month to learn the ropes before I was passed off from reporting to the director to her. For that meeting, she mentioned that I needed to be on-site 3 days a week, clocking in on-site at my scheduled time. Just so you know, I had been coming in 1 or 2 times weekly for nearly 18 months and often while clocking in at home. I also communicated that I'd started going through some yet-to-be-diagnosed gut issues that made my mornings especially unpleasant. Those details fell on deaf ears though, and I was told, "Come in at your scheduled times or get an ADA exemption." Well, I will call that a bluff. I started the ADA process, and within a matter of weeks I had documented permission to clock in from home every day at my personal discretion. Plus, a couple months later, I was diagnosed with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. This manager, thankfully, did not want to be doing this job and left recently after about 9 months. However, I get to keep clocking at home every day until the heat death of the universe thanks to their callous attitude and general indifference to my discomfort. Lucky me. Also, to add some context here, because there were a lot of questions, and to elaborate, because I communicated poorly in the title and didn't clarify on the body, so we were basically on what is called a hybrid schedule, which I was told by our director a year prior did not in fact require us to be in person even 1 day a week, just on site when necessary. I'd been clocking in at home consistently and coming to the site as needed, which had not been an issue with my previous manager or the director, who I was directly reporting to for around 9 months while they were searching for a replacement. I worded this poorly. I was not clocking in late, I was simply clocking in remotely and arriving on site later in the day. This meant commuting during 20 minutes of what would have typically been lunch or break time. So yes, I was still working the full 8 hours and have been late a single-digit number of times in over 2.5 years in this position. Also, unfortunately, getting an ADA exemption was more nebulous because my health concern was yet to be diagnosed. This manager was a terrible micromanager with severe trust issues. I can appreciate that getting an ADA exemption was best for everyone, but they also were giving me absolutely no leeway or understanding without it. I basically was not receiving a random unspoken exemption before, and they were not just following policy. They were just being a controlling ass. And yeah guys, thank you so much for watching. Please check out my endless playlist for literally endless content, and I will see you again tomorrow.